The road stretched ahead in long, uneven segments, its surface alternating between packed gravel and bare clay that turned the color of rust when rain came, then hardened in the dry weeks that followed into corrugations deep enough to be felt to the frame of any automobile moving over them. It was the summer of 1922, and somewhere in the interior of the American continent, a traveler in a Ford Model T might drive for 2 or 3 hours along a county road without passing another vehicle. The air smelled of warm dust and engine oil, and at intervals, where the road curved close to farmland, the heavier scent of freshly turned earth or livestock drifted in through the open windows. America in that decade was undergoing a transformation that appeared, on its surface, to be one of straightforward expansion. The automobile had become something within reach of ordinary working families, its price declining year after year, as Henry Ford's assembly lines outside Detroit pressed out vehicles in quantities that had no earlier parallel in the history of manufacturing. By 1920, more than 9 million motor vehicles were registered across the country, and the open road seemed to offer the nation something it had long imagined for itself, a genuine freedom of movement, unconstrained by the rail schedules and fixed routes of an earlier era. The reality of that road, however, was considerably more complicated. Moving from one state into another, or from one county into the next, meant entering a jurisdiction with its own rules about vehicle registration, permissible speed, who was authorized to drive, and what a person was allowed to carry. The legal landscape of American travel in the 1920s was not a single coherent system, but a dense and overlapping web of local, state, and federal authority, each layer which was capable of transforming an ordinary journey into a criminal matter before the next town came into view. For those who find that careful, unhurried history of this kind settles the mind at the end of the day, subscribing to the channel keeps more of it coming. The total extent of American road in 1920 amounted to approximately 3.2 million miles measured from one end of the country to the other, a figure that sounds considerable until the condition of those roads is taken into account. Of that total, fewer than 400,000 miles have been improved to any meaningful standard, meaning surface of gravel, crushed stone, macadam, or concrete in a manner that made them passable in wet weather and navigable at reasonable speed in dry conditions. The remainder of the network consisted essentially of dirt tracks, former wagon roads, and farm paths whose relationship to the automobile had never been more than approximate, their width and surface reflecting the weight of horses rather than the mechanical demands of anything heavier. When rain came to the Central Plains or to hill country of the South, these unimproved roads did not merely become difficult. They absorbed vehicle wheels to their axles in clay that hardened like ceramic once the sun returned. And the driver who set out on a cross-country journey in 1920 with any confidence that the roads marked on his paper map would correspond to roads actually encountered on the ground was almost invariably disappointed before the first state line came into view. The contrast between the aspiration and the reality of American road travel in that era can be measured most clearly against the experience of the Lincoln Highway, the single most celebrated road in the country, the project that had attracted the most organized private advocacy, the most fundraising, and the most sustained public attention since its conception by the Indianapolis businessman Carl Fisher in 1912. Fisher's original idea was simultaneously straightforward and vast. A paved road running from the Atlantic coast to Pacific, complete and drivable in its entirety by 1915, in time to carry visitors to the Panama Pacific International Exposition in San Francisco. The ambition was characteristic of the era, confident, privately financed, and largely unencumbered by detailed preliminary planning of the kind that would have made clear early how large the gap was between what Fisher envisioned and what actually existed between New York and San Francisco in the way of passable road surface. The Lincoln Highway Association, organized formally on September 10, 1913, enlisted some of the country's most prominent automotive industrialists as officers and contributors. Henry Joy, the president of the Packer Motor Car Company, served as the association's first president and proved its most methodical advocate, committing significant personal and corporate funds to surveys and selective improvements along sections of proposed route through Ohio and Indiana. Goodyear Tire and Rubber and the Willis Overland Company contributed early financing, while Henry Ford declined to participate, believing with characteristic consistency that publicly funded infrastructure was the proper mechanism for building roads, and that private subscription campaigns established a precedent he found commercially and philosophically incorrect. The association designated a route running approximately 3,389 miles from Times Square in New York City westward across New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Iowa, Nebraska, Colorado, Utah, Nevada, and finally into San Francisco. What that route actually offered travelers in the years between 1913 and 1920 was something considerably less uniform than the association's promotional literature suggested. Drivers who followed the Lincoln Highway kept journals, and those journals are consistent in their account of conditions that shifted without notice from poured concrete to crushed stone, from crushed stone to gravel, from gravel to bare clay or sand that held the vehicle fast and required unloading cargo, digging at the wheel arches, and laying brush or salvage planks beneath the tires to gain purchase. A driver crossing western Nebraska in 1918 recorded wheels sinking more than 12 inches into the road surface following several days of sustained rain. Passage across the Bonneville Salt Flats near Wendover in Utah required preparation indistinguishable from a surveying expedition. Spare tires, fuel in supplementary cans, water for the radiator, and the practical understanding that if the vehicle became disabled, assistance might not arrive for an entire day. Emily Post, the etiquette writer, drove a portion of the Lincoln Highway in 1915 and described the western sections as requiring, in her estimation, something closer to geological patience than practical road sense. The Lincoln Highway was, even at its most celebrated, a route whose passability depended on the season, the weather of the preceding fortnight, and the volunteer energy of local good roads associations that maintained short segments through county appropriations and community labor. The association's response to the persistent problem of road quality was a program it called the Seedling Mile, a strategy of funding short, high-quality paved demonstration segments at intervals along the route, with the explicit purpose of illustrating to local governments and state highway departments what a properly constructed road surface looked like and how durably it performed under regular traffic. By the early 1920s, the association had funded several dozen of these demonstration segments in Indiana, Iowa, and Nebraska, each one built to standard noticeably superior to the road connecting them. The theory was that visible, tangible examples of quality construction would generate political pressure within each state for extending the paved surface until the seedling miles were eventually joined into a continuous improved corridor. The theory had partial success. Indiana completed continuous paved surface through its section relatively early, while Wyoming and Nevada continued to present the traveler with extended stretches of unpaved and sometimes unmarked track well into the late 1920s. The disparity illustrated the fundamental limitation of private road associations as instruments of infrastructure building. They could advocate and demonstrate, but actual construction depended entirely on the appropriation decisions of state legislatures, whose priorities were set by local political pressures that bore no consistent relationship to the needs of through travelers crossing from one state to the next. The practical experience of undertaking any journey of more than 50 miles in 1920 involved a degree of preparation that is no equivalent in later automobile travel. Gasoline was available in most towns of any size, but the filling station as a purpose-built commercial enterprise was still a relatively recent arrival. The Gulf Refining Company had opened what is generally considered the first purpose-built drive-in gasoline station in Pittsburgh in 1913, and the Standard Oil Company of California had begun a systematic station-building program in the West. But large sections of the national road network remained without reliable fuel access at intervals that the Model T's 12-gallon fuel tank could bridge with any comfort. Drivers routinely carried spare fuel in separate cans, along with tire repair equipment, a hand pump, spare ignition components, and the specialized tools required to address the mechanical failures most likely to occur in their particular vehicle. The motor hotel, later contracted, in common usage, to the word motel, was beginning to appear along major named routes in California and along the Lincoln Highway corridor. But for most of the decade, the traveler without a tent was dependent on the boarding house, the hotel in whatever town presented itself at the end of the day's drive, or the hospitality of farmsteads willing to provide a room. Conditions that varied from genuinely welcoming to openly and sometimes confrontationally hostile to automobiles and the strangers who arrived in them. The federal government had made its first sustained financial commitment to civilian road improvement The Federal Aid Road Act of 1916, signed into law on July 11 of that year by President Woodrow Wilson. The act allocated $75 million to be distributed over 5 years to states that establish highway departments capable of managing construction projects to standards set and overseen by the Federal Office of Public Roads. The conditions attached to the funding were significant. Each state was required to match the federal contribution dollar for dollar. All construction work proceeded under federal supervision, and states could not simply direct the money toward whatever local projects their legislatures preferred, but had to submit work plans for approval to the Federal Administrative Channel. In its first full year of practical operation, the program assisted construction of approximately 600 miles of improved road, a number that illustrated both the scale of the undertaking and the limited pace at which the existing administrative machinery could process and execute new activity without structural expansion of its own. The First World War interrupted the gradual momentum of that program in ways that would not be fully resolved until the early 1920s. Military traffic. The sustained movement of heavy supply trucks and artillery from manufacturing centers in Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Michigan to Atlantic embarkation ports destroyed road surfaces that had been under improvement for years and exposed the structural inadequacy of bridges designed for horse and wagon loads. The Army's experience in 1917 and 1918 demonstrated, for anyone in federal service paying careful attention, that American road infrastructure was genuinely insufficient to the logistical demands of large-scale mobilization. A military convoy organized in 1919 to drive from Washington, in the District of Columbia, to San Francisco along the Lincoln Highway, conceived partly as a peacetime demonstration of military capability and partly as an extended public survey of the road's actual condition, required 62 days to complete the journey, averaging fewer than 60 miles per day across terrain that civilian automobile enthusiasts have been describing for years as a national thoroughfare ready for ordinary use. Among the officers who participated in that convoy was a 28-year-old lieutenant colonel from Abilene, Kansas, named Dwight David Eisenhower, who recorded in his diary observations about bridge failures, road surfaces that ceased to exist for considerable stretches, and the mechanical consequences of sustained travel on surfaces never designed for wheeled vehicles of any significant weight. He would carry those observations and the strategic conclusions they supported about the relationship between road infrastructure and national security through the next 35 years of his military and political career. The Federal Highway Act of 1921, signed by President Warren G. Harding on November 9th, represented a considerably more systematic federal response to the problem than the 1916 legislation it amended and extended. The new act authorized a federal aid highway system not to exceed 7% of the total road mileage in each state, concentrated federal investment on a defined network of primary routes rather than distributing aid to whatever local project states happened to oppose, and established clearer administrative standards for the state highway departments that would require channel through which federal funds flowed. Rather than spreading limited money thinly across an enormous and undifferentiated network, the 1921 Act created a conceptual framework for a primary system that could be improved systematically, segment by segment, over a sustained period of years, and it is generally considered the legislative origin of the numbered federal highway system that eventually followed. The official charge with implementing both pieces of legislation and with building the Bureau of Public Roads into an institution capable of managing its steadily expanding responsibilities was Thomas Harris McDonald, who had been appointed chief of the Bureau in 1919 and who will hold that position through an extraordinary 34 consecutive years, until 1953. McDonald was an Iowa-trained civil engineer who had spent the preceding decade managing that state's road construction program, and he brought to the Bureau a methodical temperament, a consistent emphasis on material standards and measurable engineering outcomes, and a comprehensive understanding of the relationship between road design, construction quality, and the long-run economics of maintenance. He argued consistently to Congress and the state highway officials that a road built to insufficient structural standards was not merely a poor road, but an actively expensive one, that the repeated repair expenditure required to maintain an underbuilt surface over 10 years exceeded, by a calculable margin, what a properly engineered pavement would have cost to lay in the first place. Under McDonald's direction, the Bureau conducted systematic materials testing, published detailed construction standards, trained state-level engineers, and worked in continuous coordination with the American Association of State Highway Officials, an organization of the chief highway engineers of the 48 states established in 1914 to develop something approaching a common national vocabulary for road construction and classification. That common vocabulary, however, remained incomplete through most of the 1920s, and a numbered highway system that would eventually give American roads a legible and uniform identity did not officially exist until November 11th, 1926, when American Association of State Highway Officials adopted the joint numbering plan developed in coordination with McDonald's Bureau. Before that date, travelers attempting to navigate across the country relied on named routes designated by private organizations. The Lincoln Highway, the Dixie Highway running from Chicago southward to Miami through the states of Middle South, the National Old Trails Road following the historic wagon routes westward from the capital, and the Old Spanish Trail connecting St. Augustine in Florida to San Diego along the Gulf Coast and through New Mexico. Each of these routes was promoted by its own membership association, maintained in sections by local boosters and county governments, and mapped and guides sold by automobile clubs or gasoline companies whose information about specific sections range from reasonably current to entirely obsolete by the time of purchase. A traveler planning a route across the country in 1923 was, in practical terms, assembling a patchwork of overlapping and sometimes contradictory guidance from sources with different standards of accuracy and different commercial interests in the traveler's choices. The growth in the number of vehicles using this imperfectly maintained and inconsistently documented network was not gradual, but sustained and steep. In 1900, approximately 8,000 motor vehicles were registered across the entire United States. By 1910, that figure had grown to approximately 458,000. By 1915, it exceeded 2 million, and by 1920 it stood at approximately 9.2 million. A more than 20-fold increase within a single decade. The Model T Ford, which had first appeared in 1908 at a price of approximately $850, sold by 1924 for $290, a reduction that placed automobile ownership within the realistic budget of a skilled factory worker or junior office clerk, prepared to make corresponding adjustments elsewhere in household expenditure. By 1923, Ford's Highland Park and River Rouge plants outside Detroit were producing more than 1.8 million vehicles annually, and the physical infrastructure of the roads onto which all those vehicles were introduced had fallen steadily further behind the volume of traffic being placed upon it. The consequence of this growth arriving on an inadequate and administratively inconsistent system was not simply inconvenience, but the creation of a context in which the rules governing vehicle operation had proliferated independently at every level of government, from the rural township to the county commission to the state legislature, without coordination, reciprocity, or any mechanism for making rules of one jurisdiction legible to a traveler arriving from another. Each of the 48 states maintained its own vehicle registration system, its own licensing requirements, its own speed regulations, and its own technical specifications for the equipment automobiles were required to carry. The American Association of Motor Vehicle Administrators worked throughout the 1920s to encourage standardization across these divergent systems, but had limited success with state legislatures for whom registration fees and locally administered traffic fines were significant sources of public revenue not lightly surrendered to a national template. The physical infrastructure of American roads was, therefore, not merely a landscape to which travelers moved, but a mosaic of overlapping administrative jurisdictions, each one capable of imposing its own demands on any person passing through. And that mosaic formed the foundation on which every subsequent layer of legal control over traveling Americans was deliberately and consequentially constructed. The legal structures governing who could drive across America, on what terms, and at whose discretion were as internally inconsistent and as administratively fragmented as the roads themselves. The fragmentation of American road infrastructure that characterized the early 1920s had a direct and largely unremarked counterpart in the legal systems governing who was permitted to use those roads, on what conditions, and with what documentation in hand. The gap between the physical reality of American roads and the coherent national network that engineers and federal officials were working to establish was considerable, but it was no wider than the gap between the freedom of movement that automobile ownership seemed to promise and the actual legal terrain that any motorist encountered the moment a vehicle crossed from one state into another, a driver in complete good standing with the laws of his home state, registration current, equipment in order, operated within familiar speed limits, carrying the documentation his own state required, became, at the moment of crossing a state line, a driver whose legal status in the new jurisdiction was uncertain in ways that vary by state, by county, and sometimes by individual municipality, and whose vehicle might be treated as unregistered, improperly equipped, or in violation of an ordinance that no touring guide had thought to mention, and that no sign on the road had announced in advance. The foundational problem was the near total absence of reciprocity agreements among the states for motor vehicle registration. In the early 1920s, most states did not automatically recognize vehicle registrations issued by other states as valid authorization to operate within their borders. Pennsylvania did not automatically accept New Jersey registrations as proof of the right to drive on Pennsylvania roads, and New York did not accept Connecticut registrations without qualification. And the specific terms of whatever recognition did exist were determined by bilateral administrative arrangements that changed without public announcement and were not widely publicized even when in force. The general principle that each state's registration system was a separate administrative entity meant that entering a new state with out-of-state plates was, in the strictly technical reading of applicable law, an act of operating an unregistered vehicle until the new state chose to extend recognition, which it might or might not do depending on whether a formal arrangement existed between the two states in question. Some states had entered into informal courtesy agreements with certain neighbors, particularly in the northeastern corridors where interstate automobile travel was most frequent. Others had not, and a traveler who assumed that the reciprocity one eastern state offered meant that all states operated on similar principles was likely to discover otherwise somewhere in the middle of the country. The American Automobile Association, founded on March 4, 1902, in Chicago by 9 affiliated regional motor clubs, pressed state legislatures throughout the decade to formalize reciprocity agreements, achieving partial success in a number of regions by the mid-1920s. But the coverage remained sufficiently uneven that the practical problem persisted for most drivers undertaking long-distance journeys throughout the decade. Driver licensing presented a parallel and distinct category of inconsistency that the registration problem alone did not capture. In the early 1920s, a substantial number of states required no driver's license whatsoever, a condition that reflected both the recency of the automobile as a mass phenomenon and the political difficulty of imposing new administrative requirements on a public that had embraced the vehicle with considerable enthusiasm. States that did require licenses varied significantly in what those licenses represented in practice. Some states issued credentials on application, without any examination of driving knowledge or skill, proceeding on the theory that the demonstrated willingness and ability to purchase a vehicle was sufficient evidence of competence to operate one. Others required written examinations of varying depth. A few required practical demonstration of driving ability before a licensing official, conducted on a public road. The consequence of these varying standards was that a driver fully licensed under the laws of one state might be operating as an unlicensed driver the moment he entered a state with more comprehensive requirements, and might be in compliance with the licensing laws of a third state, not because that state accepted his existing license, but simply because that state had not yet enacted any licensing requirement at all. Estimating how many states required licenses in any given year during the 1920s is complicated by the fact that several states enacted and then modified licensing legislation within short periods. But the practical landscape remained one in which the legal standing of a given driver in a given state depended on a combination of factors that the driver had no reliable mechanism for determining in advance. The specific rules governing the operation of vehicles on the road varied across states and municipalities, with a range that made general preparation for travel essentially impossible. Speed limits illustrate the disparity most directly. Some states in the early 1920s had enacted no statewide speed limit, delegating the question entirely to county commissions and municipal governments, producing regulations that reflected local conditions, local revenue expectations, and local political arrangements more reliably than any analysis of road safety. Other states set statewide limits in open country, frequently between 20 and 25 miles per hour, while leaving urban and town limits to local determination, which would produce figures of 8 or 10 miles per hour in village centers, not all of which were consistently posted with visible signs at the town boundary or at any intermediate point along the main road through the settlement. A driver maintaining a speed entirely within the law on one side of the county line could be traveling at twice the posted limit on the other side, with the road's appearance, width, and surface having changed not at all to suggest that a different legal standard was now in effect. Equipment requirements added a further category of technical compliance that varied between states in ways that common sense could not reliably anticipate. Some states required headlights that could be dimmed when approaching another vehicle from the front. Others specified minimum illumination distances without addressing the question of dimming at all. Some required specific types of braking systems, with dual-system brakes becoming a requirement in certain states before others had addressed brake specifications at all. Tire regulations vary between states in both their existence and their content. A vehicle that met every equipment requirement of its home state might fail the technical specifications of a neighboring state on one or more points, and while casual enforcement of equipment requirements against vehicles in motion was not universal, the relevant regulations existed on the books of each state independently and could be applied at any moment an officer chose to do so. The accumulation of these requirements, none of them coordinated with any other, produced a compliance standard for the multi-state traveler that was not merely demanding but was, in the most precise sense of the term, unknowable in advance. Local ordinances in small towns and rural townships added further layers of obligation entirely disconnected from any coherent principle of traffic management. In many counties across Pennsylvania and throughout rural New England, local ordinances required drivers approaching a bridge to reduce speed to walking pace, and in some jurisdictions, to stop completely and proceed only after verifying that the structure would bear the vehicle's weight. The practical origin of these requirements was structural and not unreasonable. The bridges in question had been built for horse and wagon traffic and were genuinely inadequate for loaded automobiles moving at any speed. But the legal effect was that a traveler unfamiliar with the specific local requirement was in violation from the moment the vehicle moved onto bridge at the speed that the road's appearance suggested was appropriate, and the absence of any signage indicating that a special rule applied here meant that the first notice a traveler received was the citation itself. Dozens of municipalities across the Northeast and Midwest required drivers to sound the horn before entering specific intersections. Some rural counties in Pennsylvania and Virginia maintained ordinances originating in the first years of automobile travel, when horse-drawn vehicles still dominated the roads, that required a driver whose approach appeared to frighten a horse to stop the vehicle entirely, shut off the engine, and wait until the animal had passed and the road was clear. These ordinances were still technically in force in 1922 in some jurisdictions, even where active enforcement had effectively ceased, a condition that reflected the broader pattern of legal accumulation without any corresponding administrative mechanism for removing rules that had outlived their relevance. Sunday regulations imposed a distinct category of restriction in states where Sabbatarian law had roots reaching back to the colonial period. Connecticut maintained ordinances that restricted various forms of commercial and non-essential activity on Sundays, and some municipalities applied these statutes to automobile travel with enough regularity to constitute a genuine legal risk for travelers who did not happen to know what county they had entered, what day it was, or what the local interpretation of non-essential activity included when it came to a family driving to visit relatives 3 counties away. Pennsylvania's blue laws were broader in scope and had historically been applied with more consistency in some counties than others, and the pattern of enforcement was sufficiently irregular that a traveler who passed through without incident one year could not assume the same outcome on a subsequent journey. A driver from New York or Ohio passing through these areas on a Sunday, without prior knowledge of local regulations, had no reliable means of assessing in advance whether the journey would proceed without incident or would result in a citation before the next town's church was behind him. The institution through which most of this enforcement was administered in rural areas and small towns was the Justice of the Peace, an office that occupied a position in the American legal system that was simultaneously authoritative and almost entirely unsupervised in its practical operation. Justices of the peace were not required in most states to hold law degrees or any particular formal legal qualification. They were locally elected or appointed officials, compensated in many jurisdictions through a fee system under which their personal income derived in part from the fines they imposed. A justice who found a defendant guilty and levied a fine received a portion of that fine as his fee. for conducting the proceeding. A justice who acquitted received nothing or substantially less. The structural consequence of this arrangement was predictable in direction and in practice. Conviction rates in traffic cases before rural justices of the peace ran high. Fines were typically due immediately in cash, and the alternative available to a traveler who could not or would not pay on the spot was detention in whatever local custody was available pending a hearing whose date might be set far enough in the future to require the traveler to abandon the journey, return at their own expense, and contend with a court whose disposition toward the returning out-of-state defendant was not guaranteed to be more favorable than it had been on the first occasion. Out-of-state motorists were structurally ideal subjects for this enforcement system, a fact that the practical operation of traffic enforcement in many rural counties reflected with a consistency that drew comment from journalists, automobile club representatives, and eventually from members of Congress. A traveler from Illinois stopped for a speed violation in a rural county in Virginia was unlikely to know whether the fine being demanded corresponded to any established schedule of penalties. Contesting the charge would require a return to the jurisdiction at a cost and time and travel that exceeded, in most practical situations, whatever fine was likely to be imposed. Having no local connections meant there was no informal mechanism through which the matter might be resolved without payment. The kind of quiet resolution that a local resident with long-standing relationships in the community might more easily arrange. The practical choice was between paying whatever was demanded and remaining in whatever custody the local authority maintained. And in a number of documented instances to the 1920s, travelers were held not because the offense warranted detention under any reasonable standard, but because the fine could not be paid until the bank opened the following morning, and no alternative arrangement was offered or available. The fine amounts themselves, typically ranging from $5 to $25 for ordinary speed violations in the 1920s, were not enormous in absolute terms. But for a working-class family undertaking an automobile journey on a carefully calculated budget, a $10 fine payable on the spot in cash, on top of the cost of fuel, lodging, and food already being managed, could meaningfully compromise the remainder of the journey. The American Automobile Association's response to this pattern of enforcement was practical and, in its implications, revealing. The association produced touring guides that identified road surfaces, noted distances between towns, and listed available facilities along major routes. The precursors of the detailed triptych maps the organization would later develop. It operated an emergency road service through affiliated local clubs, dispatching mechanical assistance to members who had broken down. But among its member services through the 1920s, it also distributed to each member a bail bond card, a document serving as a financial guarantee, backed by the association's institutional resources, that an arrested member would satisfy any fine assessed or appear for any required hearing, allowing the member to be released from custody without posting cash bail at the time of arrest. The association estimated by the mid-1920s that its bail bond service was being used by thousands of members annually across the country. The frequency of that use constituted the organization's practical acknowledgement that the arrest of out-of-state motorists on traffic charges had moved from the category of exceptional misfortune into that of routine hazard, a standard feature of the American travel experience that required a systematic organizational remedy rather than case-by-case assistance. The phenomenon of the deliberate speed trap, a stretch of road where artificially low-limit signs were posted at a point where the road's design invited faster travel, positioned to allow maximum enforcement with minimum advance notice, was documented through the 1920s in enough detail to generate both congressional attention and a regular advisory feature in the publications serving the motoring public. The approaches to small towns and the exits from county seats were particularly productive sites for this practice, where a limit appropriate to open country could drop suddenly to a village figure that an approaching driver had no reliable means of anticipating before the sign was already behind him. Automobile publications circulated lists of counties and municipalities known for this form of enforcement, and the American Automobile Association distributed similar intelligence through its affiliated clubs. What these advisories reflected, taken together, was a practical acknowledgement that local governments along major travel routes had identified, and by the mid-1920s had become accustomed to, a form of revenue generation that was technically lawful, required minimal administrative apparatus, and fell exclusively on people passing through rather than on the local constituents who would vote in the next election, a revenue mechanism embedded so naturally in the existing architecture of local authority that it required no formal policy decision and no public justification. The National Conference on Street and Highway Safety convened in Washington in 1924 at the initiative of Herbert Hoover in his capacity as Secretary of Commerce under President Calvin Coolidge, represented the first systematic federal-level attempt to address the inconsistencies that years of organized complaint had documented. Hoover brought together representatives of state highway departments, automobile manufacturers, insurance companies, law enforcement agencies, and public health organizations, and the conference produced recommendations that acknowledged, in an official federal context for the first time, that the patchwork of state and local traffic law had become a functional obstacle to the safe and orderly use of a road network that federal and state governments had been building and funding for more than a decade. The conference's recommendations covered uniform speed limit standards, consistent equipment requirements, reciprocal registration recognition, and the standardization of traffic signals, the last of which had proliferated in American cities through the early 1920s, with similar absence of coordination, producing intersections where the same color light meant different things in different cities. The recommendations were not binding on any state, because the federal government held no constitutional authority to impose traffic regulations directly on state systems, but they established a framework that the National Committee on Uniform Traffic Laws and Ordinances subsequently used to produce the first edition of the Uniform Vehicle Code in 1926. The adoption of the Uniform Vehicle Code was slow, partial, and entirely voluntary, and for most of the remainder of the decade, it remained an aspiration rather than an accomplished fact. States had accumulated years of administrative investment in their individual registration systems, licensing frameworks, and enforcement practices, and harmonizing those systems with a national model required legislative action that faced resistance from the officials whose authority and whose revenue streams were organized around the existing arrangements. County governments whose annual budgets incorporated a calculable contribution from traffic fines levied against out-of-state travelers had a material interest in the continued operation of enforcement mechanisms that the Uniform Vehicle Code, if adopted, would constrain. That interest was represented in state legislatures through the county commissioners and rural legislators who understood that uniform traffic law, whatever its benefits for travelers in the aggregate, would reduce the revenue that local enforcement currently extracted from the steady flow of strangers on the main roads. The infrastructure of legal control over motorized travel in the 1920s was not, in this reading, an accident or an administrative oversight. It was a system that served the interests of those who administered it, and would yield to reform only as the automobile industry, the federal government, and organized motoring interests accumulated sufficient political weight to overcome the localized resistance that reform required. For the traveling public of the 1920s, that reform remained a future matter, and the road ahead continued to be a sequence of legal jurisdictions, each capable of transforming a compliant and careful driver into a criminal before the next town came into view. The dangers these conditions created for automobile owners were genuine and financially consequential, but they were, as the following account makes clear, considerably more tolerable than the situation confronting the millions of Americans who travel the country's roads and railways without the relative protection that even an imperfectly registered private vehicle could provide. The traveler who moved across America in the 1920s without an automobile did not merely face a harder physical journey. He or she inhabited, in the most direct legal sense, a different country. The automobile, for all the administrative complications its use entailed, was at minimum a piece of documented property. It carried a registration number. It implied a home address where that registration had been issued, and it suggested, however imperfectly, that its operator possessed a degree of economic stability sufficient to have purchased or financed a vehicle in the first place. For the millions of Americans who travel by freight train, on foot, or by occasional wagon ride, who moved in search of agricultural work, who followed the seasonal harvest from Texas cotton fields to California fruit orchards, who were adrift between jobs in the period of economic turbulence that followed the brief post-war boom, the law offered no comparable ambiguity. The act of traveling while poor was, under the vagrancy statutes, active in every American state, presumptively criminal from the moment it began. The legal infrastructure of vagrancy law that operated across the United States in the 1920s was old, substantially unchanged in its fundamental structure from English antecedents, and organized around a set of assumptions about social order, labor, and mobility that have been embedded in Anglo-American law for more than 3 centuries. The Tudor-era statutes governing sturdy beggars, able-bodied individuals without employment or fixed domicile who were found moving to the countryside, represented the original framework from which American vagrancy law descended, and their central organizing principle, that unauthorized movement by a person without visible economic means was itself evidence of moral and legal deficiency, survived translation to the American context with minimal modification. The English Vagrancy Act of 1824 codified and modernized these Tudor precedents, defining a vagrant as any person found wandering in streets or public places without visible means of support, and American state legislatures through the 19th century had adapted and extended this definition to address specific conditions of American social geography, producing statutes that varied in their precise wording, but were consistent in their essential structure. A person who could not demonstrate, on demand, a fixed place of residence, a named employer, and sufficient financial resources for immediate self-support could be arrested, charged with vagrancy, convicted without any further evidence that a specific crime had been committed, and sentenced to a fine or a term of hard labor. By 1920, the standard vagrancy definition active in American state law encompassed a remarkably broad range of human conditions. Most statutes listed their covered categories explicitly: persons wander without employment, persons without a fixed abode, persons who were idle in estimation of the arresting officer, persons found sleeping in public spaces, persons soliciting money or goods from strangers, persons traveling by freight train without authorization, and, in a category added in many states through the first 2 decades of the century in response to political anxieties about organized labor, persons who advocated doctrines deemed subversive of social order or opposed the institution of private property. The practical consequence of this accumulated list of covered conditions was that a police officer or sheriff's deputy who encountered a person traveling without obvious means in essentially any public space had a statutory basis for arrest that required no specific act of harm, no identified victim, and no particular evidence beyond the appearance of the person encountered and the officer's subjective assessment of whether that person resembled a vagrant. The standard of probable cause that would apply to an arrest for theft or assault did not apply in the same way to a vagrancy arrest, because vagrancy was defined as a condition rather than an act, and the officer's assessment of that condition was simultaneously the probable cause and the primary evidence. The population to which vagrancy law was most consistently applied in the 1920s was a substantial and economically significant community of itinerant laborers who moved seasonally between the agricultural and industrial regions of the country, following the rhythms of planting, harvest, construction, and logging that required large temporary workforces in concentrated locations for specific periods, and then released those workforces to disperse until the next season's work began. Estimates of the size of this population vary depending on the source and the definition employed, but Nels Anderson, a sociologist at the University of Chicago, whose study titled The Hobo, published in 1923, represented the most systematic academic investigation of the phenomenon undertaken during the decade, estimated that the number of men regularly following the hobo pattern of seasonal migration across the country's labor markets numbered somewhere between 200,000 and 500,000 at any given time, with additional hundreds of thousands moving in and out of that pattern in response to changing personal and economic circumstances. Anderson's study described the physical and social geography of the itinerant laborer's life in specific terms: the rooming houses and employment agencies of Chicago's West Madison Street corridor, which served as the informal headquarters of the national migratory labor system; the specific agricultural circuits that took men from the wheat harvest in Kansas and Oklahoma northward to the Dakotas and into Canada; the logging camps of the Pacific Northwest; the fruit orchards of California's Central Valley; and the copper and silver mines of Arizona, Nevada, and Montana that required a constant supply of mobile labor willing to work under conditions that permanent local residents refused. Anderson, who had himself lived as an itinerant laborer before returning to formal education, wrote from a position of direct familiarity with the system he was documenting, and his account carries a specificity of detail that distinguishes it from a more distant sociological literature of the period. The primary means by which this population moved was the freight train, and the relationship between the railroad companies and the men who rode their cars without payment was one of the defining institutional tensions of American labor life in the early 20th century. The Southern Pacific Railroad, operating through California, Oregon, Nevada, Arizona, and across the Southwest into Texas and Louisiana, maintained a private police force, the Southern Pacific Railroad Police, whose official mandate was the protection of company property and the enforcement of trespassing laws on railroad rights-of-way, and whose practical function included the systematic removal of unauthorized passengers from freight cars, the arrest and delivery to local authorities of individuals found on railroad property without permission, and the physical discouragement of attempts to board moving equipment. The Southern Pacific's force was among the largest of the railroad police organizations in the country, but every major railroad maintained a comparable unit. The Union Pacific Railroad Police, the Santa Fe Special Service Bureau, and similar organizations operating for the Illinois Central Railroad and the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad in the eastern half of the country. The legal authority of these private forces was a matter of ongoing ambiguity. They operated under state-issued law enforcement commissions that gave individual agents powers of arrest, but left the precise extent of those powers dependent on the specific statutes of each state in which the arrest occurred, producing situations in which the same act of enforcement might be legally unambiguous in one state and procedurally questionable in the next. The Industrial Workers of the World, founded on June 27, 1905 in Chicago at a convention whose delegates included William Dudley Haywood of the Western Federation of Miners and Eugene Victor Debs of the Socialist Party of America, had made the organization of migratory and unskilled labor its particular institutional mission from its first years of operation. The organization's structure, which deliberately rejected the craft union model of the American Federation of Labor in favor of broad industrial unionism, organizing all workers in a given industry regardless of skill or trade classification under a single organizational structure, suited the itinerant labor population in ways that conventional trade unions could not accommodate. A member who moved from a Montana copper mine to an Oregon logging camp to a California wheat harvest could remain a member of the industrial workers of the world throughout that journey, carrying his red membership card from employer to employer and from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, in a manner that craft unions, whose membership was tied to a specific trade practice in a specific location, had no institutional mechanism to replicate. This organizing model, combined with the organization's explicit advocacy for direct industrial action and its rhetorical sympathy for syndicalist economic theory, made the industrial workers of the world the primary target of the anti-labor legal apparatus that state governments constructed with gathering intensity through the 1910s and 1920s. By 1920, 33 states had enacted criminal syndicalism laws, statutes that criminalized not merely specific acts of violence or property destruction, but the advocacy of industrial sabotage or violent political change as a means of achieving economic or political ends. The California Criminal Syndicalism Act of 1919 was among the most aggressively drafted and consistently applied to these measures, defining criminal syndicalism as a doctrine that advocated crime, sabotage, violence, or unlawful methods of terrorism as a means of accomplishing industrial or political change. The definition was broad enough to encompass a substantial portion of the organizational literature circulated by the industrial workers of the world, and California prosecutors applied it with corresponding energy throughout the early 1920s. By 1924, the state had recorded more than 500 prosecutions under the Act, an enforcement rate far exceeding that of any other state, and the cumulative effect was to establish California, for the purposes of the itinerant labor community moving through the West, as a jurisdiction where membership in a disfavored organization constituted a criminal act regardless of whether the individual member had participated in or even been aware of any specific violent or disruptive conduct. The act of traveling to California to seek agricultural employment while carrying an industrial workers of the world membership card was, under the 1919 statute, applied with a vigor that characterized its first 5 years of enforcement, an act of potential criminal exposure that began before the traveler had set foot on any work site. The political climate in which these laws were enacted and enforced had been materially shaped by the events of 1919, A year of labor unrest, political bombings, and governmental anxiety that produced a federal response disproportionate in scale to any objective assessment of the threat it addressed, and that permanently reconfigured the relationship between the federal government and the politically marginal traveler. Attorney General Alexander Mitchell Palmer, who had survived the bombing of his Washington home on our street on the night of June 2nd, 1919, oversaw the organization of a domestic intelligence unit within the Bureau of Investigation specifically tasked with identifying, surveilling, and ultimately removing from the country the radical elements Palmer held responsible for the summer's wave of political violence and labor disruption. The official placed in direct charge of this General Intelligence Division was John Edgar Hoover, 24 years old in 1919, who brought to the assignment a methodical organizational intelligence and a capacity for bureaucratic self-preservation that would define the federal law enforcement apparatus for the next half-century. Hoover's division compiled files on more than 200,000 individuals and organizations in its first year of operation, drawing on a network of informants and on surveillance records assembled during the war years. And it was this intelligence infrastructure that provided the operational basis for the coordinated federal actions that followed. The first set of raids, conducted on November 7th and 8th of 1919, the second anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, a date chosen for its symbolic resonance, targeted offices of the Union of Russian Workers in 12 cities, resulting in the arrest of approximately 650 individuals and the eventual deportation of 249 of them on the Army Transport United States Army Transport Buford, which departed New York Harbor on December 21st bound for Finland, its passengers consigned ultimately to Soviet Russia. The second and considerably larger wave of raids, executed on January 2nd and 3rd of 1920, targeted the offices of the Communist Party of America and the Communist Labor Party in 33 cities simultaneously, resulting in the arrest of somewhere between 4,000 and 10,000 individuals, depending on the source. Many of those arrested were held in local custody for weeks without access to legal representation, without formal charges being filed, and in facilities whose physical capacity was substantially exceeded by the number of people detained within them. Jails in Detroit, Boston, and Hartford held detainees under conditions that subsequent investigative accounts described as overcrowded to the point of constituting a public health hazard. The Bureau of Investigation's operational definition of a suspect was, for practical purposes, anyone found in or near a meeting place of an organization on the target list, regardless of the specific individual's relationship to that organization or his knowledge of its activities, which meant that the act of being present in a particular building, itself an act of movement, of travel between locations, was sufficient to produce arrest. The apparatus of municipal ordinance that existed alongside vagrancy law and criminal syndicalism statutes extended the reach of the system in ways that state-level legislation alone did not capture. Chicago had enacted in 1867 what became known colloquially as an ugly law, a municipal ordinance prohibiting any person who was diseased, maimed, mutilated, or in any way deformed so as to be an unsightly or disgusting object from appearing in public spaces. San Francisco and several other American cities had enacted similar ordinances in the same period, and these municipal laws remained technically enforced through the 1920s, providing a further legal basis for removal from public spaces of individuals whose appearance, clothing, or physical condition offended the assessment of an officer or a complaining citizen. For the itinerant traveler arriving in a city after days or weeks on freight trains, with clothing worn from continuous use, and a physical appearance reflecting the conditions of outdoor travel in all weather, and without access to regular washing facilities, the ugly law and its equivalents in other municipalities represented a legal mechanism of exclusion from public space that required no act of vagrancy, no evidence of poverty as a legal condition, and no demonstration of intent. Only the subjective assessment that the person's presence was incompatible with the conditions of public order that the municipality chose to enforce. The American Civil Liberties Union, founded in January of 1920 with Roger Nash Baldwin as its executive director and with a board that included Felix Frankfurter of Harvard Law School, Helen Keller, and Norman Thomas, had been organized in direct response to the civil liberties consequences of the Palmer raids and the wartime suppression of political speech that had preceded them. The organization's early litigation focused on free speech claims and on the rights of individuals arrested and detained under criminal syndicalism statutes, and its early publications documented in systematic detail the conditions under which itinerant workers and political organizers were being processed through local and state court systems. Baldwin, who had himself served a prison term in 1919 for refusing military conscription on political grounds, brought to the organization a direct personal familiarity with the distance between the legal system as it existed on paper and the legal system as it operated in practice against people without institutional resources or social standing. The American Civil Liberties Union's foundational documents articulated a theory of civil liberties that extended explicitly to freedom of movement as a component of political freedom, on the premise that the capacity to organize, to assemble, and to advocate required the physical ability to travel between locations, and that a legal system which criminalized that act of movement for people without economic means was a system which criminalized political participation itself. What the several overlapping layers of vagrancy law, criminal syndicalism statute, railroad police authority, and municipal ordinance produced together was not a series of unrelated legal constraints, but a coordinated infrastructure control, informal in the sense that no central authority had designed it as a unified system, but coherent in its cumulative effect on the person attempting to move through the country without money, property, or institutional protection. The itinerant laborer who stepped off a freight car in a California town in 1923 was potentially subject to arrest under the vagrancy statute for lacking visible means of support. Under California Criminal Syndicalism Act, it is organizational membership, or reading material reflected certain political views. Under local ordinances, if his appearance failed to meet municipal standards for public space, and at risk of detention by Southern Pacific Railroad police if his route back to the rail yard, cross a railroad right away. None of these mechanisms required evidence of harm to any identifiable person or property. All of them required only the presence of the traveler in a space where an authorized agent of a controlling institution chose to take notice of him. The two Americas of 1920s travel were separated not by distance or geography, but by the possession of just enough documented property to move the traveler from the category of the vagrant to the category of the motoring citizen, whose legal vulnerabilities, though genuine and at times financially serious, remained in a different order of magnitude entirely from those faced by the person who traveled without any such documentation at all. That foundational inequality between the citizen whose movement was regulated and the person whose movement was criminalized was a condition onto which a further layer of federal restriction was about to be placed. The enforcement apparatus created by Prohibition, which added to the ordinary automobile journey a new category of criminal exposure that neither the documented motorist nor the traveling public more broadly had anticipated when the 18th Amendment took effect in January of 1920. The 18th Amendment to the Constitution of the United States was ratified on January 16, 1919, and took effect precisely 1 year later, on January 17, 1920, transforming the manufacture, sale, and transportation of intoxicating liquors from a regulated commercial activity into a federal crime. What this transformation meant in practice for the ordinary traveler was not immediately obvious from the amendment's text alone. The amendment prohibited manufacture, sale, and transportation without specifying precise conditions under which each of those acts became criminal, leaving the definition of those conditions to the enabling legislation that Congress was required to enact. The legislation that followed, the National Prohibition Act of 1919, was considerably more specific in its reach than the amendment's spare constitutional language had suggested it might be, and its implications for the American traveler were embedded in its provisions in ways that became clear only as enforcement accumulated experience, and as the courts worked through the legal questions the Act's application raised in the years that followed. The National Prohibition Act had been drafted primarily by Wayne Bidwell Wheeler, the General Counsel of the Anti-Saloon League, and the most effective legislative strategist the temperance movement had ever produced, who had spent 2 decades building the Anti-Saloon League into one of the most disciplined single-issue lobbying organizations in American political history, coordinating the campaign efforts of Protestant churches across the country into a focused and sustained pressure on individual members of Congress in their home districts. The legislative text Wheeler produced, shepherded through Congress under the nominal sponsorship of Andrew Volstead, a Republican congressman from Minnesota, who served as chairman of the House Judiciary Committee, defined intoxicating liquors as any beverage containing more than 0.5% alcohol by volume, a standard so low that it encompassed beer and light wines alongside distilled spirits, and significantly exceeded what many legislators had understood themselves to be voting. For when the amendment was under consideration, the National Prohibition Act was passed over President Woodrow Wilson's veto on October 28, 1919, and Wilson's veto message noted with evident frustration that the country was still technically in a state of wartime emergency under which temporary alcohol restrictions had been imposed, and that making those restrictions permanent exceeded what the constitutional question of the amendment itself had settled. Congress overrode the veto, and the act took effect with the amendment on January 17, 1920. The provision of the National Prohibition Act most directly applicable to the traveling public was contained in Section 3 of the legislation, which prohibited the transportation of any intoxicating liquor from one state into any other state or territory in which the sale of intoxicating liquor was prohibited under state law, and further prohibited the transportation of intoxicating liquor into any state in violation of that state's own laws regarding such transport. The immediate practical consequence of this provision was that the legal status of quantity of alcohol in a vehicle depended not merely on the law of the state from which the journey had begun, but on the law of every state through which the vehicle subsequently passed, and on the intended destination's legal status under both federal and state law simultaneously. A bottle of wine acquired legally in one of the states slow to develop its own prohibition enforcement, or acquired before the act's effective date from a commercial source that had been entirely legal at the time of purchase, became contraband under federal law the moment the vehicle carrying it crossed into a state that prohibited importation, regardless of the quantity involved, regardless of whether the owner intended to sell it or merely to consume it privately, and regardless of whether the amount could by any practical measure be considered evidence of commercial bootlegging rather than simple personal use. The act made no initial provision for a minimized exception that might treat quantities of alcohol below a certain threshold differently from commercial shipments, a legislative choice that Wheeler's influence over the drafting process had ensured. The enforcement apparatus created to administer these provisions was housed within the Treasury Department under a Prohibition Commissioner, a position first held by John Franklin Kramer and subsequently by Roy Asa Haynes, who served from 1921 to 1927. The Bureau of Prohibition, as the enforcement unit came to be known, maintained a national force that grew from approximately 1,500 agents in 1920 to approximately 4,000 by 1925, a figure that sounds substantial until is measured against the enforcement task. The country's road network encompassed millions of miles. The borders between wet and dry jurisdictions formed a geographic patchwork of remarkable complexity, and the border between Michigan and Canada, particularly the several crossings in the Detroit area where Windsor, Ontario, lay directly across the Detroit River, was among the most productive corridors for illegal alcohol importation in the country, a fact that every resident of the metropolitan area understood, and that the Bureau's Detroit office was structurally incapable of addressing with personnel available to it. Estimates derived from congressional testimony and federal court records suggest that by 1923, between 75 and 85% of all illegal alcohol entering Michigan entered through the Detroit River crossings, and that the Bureau's seizures in that corridor represented a fraction that investigators and prosecutors appearing before congressional committees found diplomatically difficult to quantify with precision. The official most aggressively associated with federal prohibition enforcement through the 1920s was not the succession of prohibition commissioners, but Mabel Walker Willebrand, who served as Assistant Attorney General of the United States from 1921 to 1929 under both Presidents Warren G. Harding and Calvin Coolidge. Willebrand was 31 years old when appointed, had been practicing law in Los Angeles for 6 years, following her admission to the California bar in 1915, and arrived in Washington with a practical and unsentimental approach to federal criminal prosecution that made her the most effective senior enforcement official the Prohibition era produced. Her responsibilities encompassed not merely liquor law violations, but the entire range of federal criminal prosecution coordinated through the Department of Justice, and she became over the course of the decade the architect of a prosecution strategy that targeted not individual bootleggers, of whom there were too many to prosecute in any volume that would materially reduce the trade, but the financial infrastructure supporting bootlegging operations, the banks that accepted and held proceeds, the landlords who rented properties used for illegal production, and the public officials whose demonstrated willingness to accept payments for ignoring violations made enforcement in specific cities and counties effectively impossible. Braun's congressional testimony on the corruption within the enforcement apparatus was among the most consequential federal testimony of the decade, documenting with systematic specificity the degree to which the Bureau of Prohibition's own agents were among the primary beneficiaries of the system they were authorized to suppress. The condition of the enforcement apparatus that Braun's testimony described was one of endemic corruption whose geographic and institutional scope exceeded what any administrative reorganization undertaken during the decade could address. Bureau of Prohibition agents were among the lowest paid federal law enforcement officials in the government. Their initial salary fixed at approximately $1,200 annually, a figure that compared unfavorably with the wages available to skilled manufacturing workers in the industrial cities where much of the bootlegging trade was concentrated. The combination of low pay, extraordinary financial temptation, and the practical impossibility of enforcing a law against which a substantial fraction of the American public was actively resistant produced an agency whose corruption was not incidental but structural. Congressional hearings in 1926 on the condition of the Bureau established through testimony and documentary evidence that in several major American cities, enforcement operations have been so thoroughly compromised by payments from bootlegging organizations that agents function less as law enforcers than as a regulated cost of doing business, receiving regular payments in exchange for advance notice of planned raids, for the return of confiscated equipment, and for the modification of seizure reports to reduce the apparent scale of operations. Senator James Wadsworth of New York, a consistent opponent of the amendment, introduced evidence establishing that in the state alone, hundreds of agents have been dismissed for conduct ranging from accepting bribes to active participation in the bootlegging operations they were authorized to suppress. The Willis-Campbell Act in 1921 had further complicated the legal landscape by restricting the ability of physicians to prescribe beer as a medicinal treatment, a legal provision that had been widely exploited as a practical route to legal alcohol in the Act's first 2 years, with the number of physician-issued prescriptions for whiskey and wine reaching into hundreds of thousands nationally within months of the Act's implementation. The Willis-Campbell Act narrowed this channel, concentrating the trade more completely in the hands of criminal distribution organizations whose established relationships with enforcement officials had become, by the mid-1920s, a recognized feature of the urban economy in every major American city. For the ordinary traveler who had no connection to the bootlegging trade and whose possession of alcohol was a matter of personal convenience rather than commercial distribution, the Willis-Campbell Act's principal effect was to remove one of the remaining legal routes through which alcohol could be acquired for a journey, while the enforcement apparatus's structural corruption meant that the burden of compliance fell most heavily on the traveler who most conscientiously attempted to comply, rather than on the operations that the statute had been designed to target. For the ordinary traveler carrying alcohol without commercial intent, the enforcement apparatus created by the Volstead Act represented a category of criminal exposure that had not previously existed in American law. A family driving from New York to visit relatives in Ohio in 1922, who had packed several bottles of wine acquired before the Act's effective date, or obtained through one of the several technically legal channels that still existed in the Act's early years, was carrying under federal law contraband whose legal status varied with each state line crossed, and whose discovery during any stop, for a traffic violation, for a mechanical breakdown, for any reason that brought the vehicle to an officer's attention, could produce a federal charge rather than the minor local infraction the circumstances of the original stop had suggested. The specifics of what that discovery could legally produce were uncertain for the first several years of the Act's operation, because the question of whether a law enforcement officer could search an automobile without a warrant on the basis of suspicion that it contained illegal alcohol had not been definitively resolved by the courts, and different federal district courts had applied different standards to the same legal question, producing a landscape as inconsistent as the one governing vehicle registration and speed limits. That uncertainty was resolved, though not in the direction that civil liberties advocates had argued for, by the Supreme Court's decision in Carroll v. United States, handed down on March 2, 1925. The case arose from the arrest of George Carroll and John Kiro, two Michigan men stopped by Prohibition agents on the road between Detroit and Grand Rapids in 1921. The agents, who had prior knowledge that Carroll was involved in bootlegging, stopped the vehicle on the basis of that prior knowledge and searched it without a warrant, discovering 68 bottles of whiskey and gin concealed within the upholstered seat cushions of the automobile. Carroll's attorneys argued that the warrantless search violated the Fourth Amendment's protection against unreasonable searches and seizures, a position supported by the established legal principle that a search of a residential premises required a warrant obtained in advance from a judicial authority. Chief Justice William Howard Taft, writing for the majority in a 7-2 decision, declined to extend the premises standard to automobiles on the ground that a vehicle's inherent mobility made prior warrant acquisition impractical in circumstances where probable cause to believe contraband was present existed and where the opportunity to conduct the search would be lost if the vehicle were permitted to proceed while an officer sought judicial authorization. The Carroll decision established what has since been called the automobile exception to the Fourth Amendment's warrant requirement, a legal principle that remains active in American constitutional law. And its practical consequence to the traveler of 1925 and afterward was that any law enforcement officer with articulable grounds for suspecting the presence of illegal alcohol could search the vehicle at the roadside without advance judicial authorization at the moment of the stop. The roadside checkpoint was not created by the Carroll decision. Checkpoints on routes known for liquor transport have been operating in various forms since the early years of Prohibition enforcement, but the decision clarified the legal basis on which they could operate and strengthened the standing of agents who conducted searches at them. On roads understood to be corridors for bootlegging distribution, the routes leading south from Detroit toward Toledo and Columbus, the roads connecting New York City to the Connecticut and New Jersey countryside, where several significant production operations had established themselves, the principal approaches to Chicago from the north and east. Prohibition enforcement operations established periodic stopping points at which vehicles were examined and where the examining agent's assessment suggested a basis for further investigation searched. The line between an assessment grounded in articulable probable cause and one derived from the agent's personal inclinations, existing financial arrangements with specific bootlegging organizations, or straightforward profiling of the vehicle's occupants by appearance, class, or race was a line that existed in legal theory, but not reliably in the practical operation of enforcement at the roadside. A traveler in an expensive automobile with a prosperous appearance and confident manner might pass a checkpoint without extended delay. A traveler in a worn vehicle, with a road-worn appearance of someone who had driven a long distance on a limited budget, was at considerably greater risk of a thorough examination regardless of whether any specific evidence of illegal activity was visible. The wet county and dry county patchwork within individual states created a further dimension of legal exposure that the federal framework of the Volstead Act compounded without resolving. A number of states had enacted their own prohibition laws before the federal amendment, and many of these state laws included local option provisions that allowed individual counties or municipalities to vote separately on whether to permit alcohol sales within their borders, producing a geographic mosaic of legal variation whose complexity exceeded what any touring guide reliably documented. Kansas had been nominally dry under its own state constitution since 1881, but actual enforcement across the state's 105 counties had never been consistent. Mississippi maintained state prohibition while simultaneously generating, through its Delta counties, some of the most significant bootlegging operations in the South. Within states with mixed local option status, a traveler crossing from a wet county into a dry county while carrying a bottle of spirits acquired legally a few miles back was, under the applicable state statute, transporting liquor into a dry jurisdiction without authorization, a state law violation that existed independently of the federal Volstead Act, enforceable by local sheriffs and county prosecutors who applied it with the same structural revenue incentives that governed the application of traffic ordinances against out-of-state motorists generally. What the Prohibition enforcement apparatus had constructed by the middle years of the 1920s was the first genuinely national system of law enforcement applied to the ordinary use of American roads, not a system designed to regulate the roads themselves, as the traffic ordinances and registration requirements of state and local government were, but a system aimed at controlling what traveled on those roads, who carried it, and in what direction it moved across the lines between jurisdictions. This was a qualitatively new kind of federal presence in the landscape of American travel, and it established institutional patterns of roadside authority that survived the amendment's repeal in 1933, embedded in customs enforcement practice, in the agricultural inspection stations of western states, and in the architecture of Fourth Amendment doctrine that Carroll versus United States had constructed around the automobile as a space subject to governmental search on a standard of evidence different from that applicable to a fixed dwelling. For the traveling public of the 1920s, however, the most pressing observation was immediate and practical. Crossing a state line in America had acquired another layer of criminal exposure, enforced by agents whose legal authority was broad, whose institutional accountability was limited, and whose personal financial circumstances made the corruption of their official conduct a rational economic calculation. These conditions applied with particular force to white motorists and white travelers without fixed domicile. For Black Americans moving to the same landscape of roads and checkpoints and administrative authority, the ordinary hazards of 1920s travel were compounded by a separate and more immediately dangerous infrastructure of exclusion whose legal foundations were no less thoroughly embedded in American law and practice, and whose consequences for travel who misjudged its territory were, with grim regularity, not fines or administrative inconvenience, but something considerably and irreversibly worse. The sundown town was not, in the 1920s, a recognized legal category or an official municipal designation. It was an informal term applied to a formally operating reality, a town, village, township, or county from which Black Americans were excluded by ordinance, by posted warning, by the systematic application of vagrancy law to any Black individual found within its limits after dark, or by the commonly understood threat of violence enforced with sufficient regularity that the warning had not required repeating within living memory. The warning itself took various forms across the country's geography. In some towns, signs were posted at the city limits, the language varying by location, but the instruction consistent in its meaning. In others, the practice was communicated through the informal networks of knowledge that governed movement through hostile terrain, passed from traveler to traveler, from church congregation to congregation, from the advice of conductor on a segregated train to a passenger consulting a timetable. What the warning communicated, wherever and however it was transmitted, was that the legal infrastructure of the town in question would be applied to Black individuals in ways that it would not be applied to white individuals, and that remaining past the designated hour or attempting to establish presence in the designated jurisdiction was an act whose consequences the warning did not fully specify, but whose direction was not uncertain. The scope of this phenomenon across the United States in the 1920s was considerably larger than popular historical memory has generally accommodated. James William Loewen, a sociologist whose research across several decades produced the study Sundown Towns, a hidden dimension of American racism, published in 2005, documented through examination of census records, municipal ordinances, newspaper archives, and oral testimony approximately 10,000 communities across the United States that had at some point maintained systematic racial exclusion of Black residents or travelers. Loewen's analysis distributed these communities unevenly across the American map, but concentrated them not in the Deep South, where a distinct system of legal segregation operated through the apparatus of Jim Crow, but across the North, the Midwest, and the border states, precisely the regions toward which the first wave of the Great Migration was directing its movement, and through which the routes most heavily traveled by Black Americans moving between the South and the Northern industrial cities necessarily passed. The significance of Loewen's geographic finding was not merely historical curiosity, but a precise description of the terrain through which Black travelers in the 1920s were navigating when they moved between communities they knew to be relatively safe. The first wave of the Great Migration, the movement of Black Americans from the agricultural South to the industrial and commercial cities of the North and Midwest that historians generally date from approximately 1910 through 1930, carried an estimated 1.6 million individuals northward along routes that passed through towns, counties, and states whose formal legal systems and informal social arrangements had been organized to resist exactly this movement. The migration was driven by conditions in the South that required no hyperbole to describe. The persistence of sharecropping and tenant farming systems that reproduced the economic subordination of slavery without its formal legal structure. the systematic disenfranchisement of black voters through poll taxes, literacy tests, and grandfather clauses that the Supreme Court had declined in decisive terms to strike down, and the reign of lynching as an instrument of social control whose frequency, through the first decades of the 20th century, was documented by the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People in annual reports that listed by name, location, and date each killing whose occurrence could be verified. The northern industrial economy, particularly the steel mills and meatpacking plants of Chicago, Pittsburgh, and Detroit, and the manufacturing operations at wartime production had expanded rapidly after 1917, offered wages and conditions that compared favorably with anything available to agricultural labor in the Cotton Belt, and the Chicago Defender, the newspaper published by Robert Sengstack Abbott from Chicago's South Side, actively encouraged the migration through editorial advocacy, advice to prospective migrants, and the publication of correspondence from readers who had already made the journey. Abbott had founded the Chicago Defender in 1905 with an initial investment of approximately 25 cents and had built it, by 1920, into a newspaper with a weekly circulation of approximately 230,000 copies, distributed across the country through networks of Pullman porters who carried bundles of the paper south on the overnight trains and left them with church deacons, barbers, and local correspondents who distributed them through the communities. The paper could not reach by postal subscription. The Defender's influence on the pattern and timing of the Great Migration was substantial enough that Mississippi officials at various points in the migration's first decade attempted to restrict its circulation within the state, on the grounds that its content was incendiary, a characterization that reflected accurately enough the state's assessment of any journalism that described conditions of black life in the South as remediable rather than fixed. The Defender published practical information relevant to the migrating traveler, rail routes, fares, the locations of churches and fraternal organizations in northern cities that could provide temporary accommodation, the addresses of employment agencies that dealt fairly with black applicants, and, in the section of the paper most directly relevant to the hazards of the journey itself, informal advisories about conditions along the routes, drawn from readers' correspondence. The legal mechanisms through which racial exclusion was maintained in northern and midwestern sundown towns were not informal, but were embedded in the ordinary apparatus of municipal and county governance, giving the exclusion a legal foundation that required no appeal to custom or threat, and could be enforced through the normal channels of arrest, prosecution, and civil litigation. Municipal ordinances in dozens of towns explicitly restricted black residency, sometimes under the cover of neutral language about property qualifications or local residency requirements whose practical application was never neutral. Racially restrictive deed covenants, legal instruments attached to the titles of residential properties that prohibited their sale or rental to individuals of specified racial categories, were enforceable in civil court and had been sustained by the federal judiciary on the grounds that they were private contracts rather than state action, and therefore outside the constitutional prohibitions applicable to governmental racial discrimination. The Supreme Court's decision in Corrigan versus Buckley, handed down in 1926 and arising from a restrictive covenant dispute in Washington, the District of Columbia, held that federal courts could not be used to challenge such covenants on constitutional grounds, a holding that remained the governing legal standard until Shelley versus Kramer partially limited it in 1948. In counties across Indiana, a state whose Ku Klux Klan membership in the early 1920s, estimated at approximately 250,000 individuals by 1924, represented the largest state-level Klan organization in the country. County-level political authority and Klan organizational infrastructure overlapped sufficiently that the enforcement of informal racial exclusion required no formal legal proceeding at all. The specific communities that had established and maintained exclusion most thoroughly and over the longest periods illustrate the geographic breadth of the practice, without exhausting it. Anna, in Union County in southern Illinois, had driven out its black residents in 1909 and maintained effective exclusion through the subsequent decades, with the town's reputation widely known across the region as a matter of practical navigation rather than historical curiosity. Coleman, in Alabama's Northwest, had been established in 1873 by a German immigrant community under conditions that included explicit racial exclusion from the town's founding documents. Corbin, in southeastern Kentucky, had expelled its black population in 1912 through organized violence, and its workforce in the 1920s remained entirely white through the combination of that historical act and the understood terms of continued exclusion. Vidor, in Orange County in southeastern Texas, maintained exclusion of black residents through a combination of formal restriction and the informal social authority of the white community sufficiently effectively that its reputation as a sundown town persisted through the entire 20th century and into the 21st. These communities were not regional anomalies but representative instances of a pattern that stretched across the country's northern and western states with density that the northern mythology of racial tolerance, cultivated in contrast to the South's Jim Crow formalism, could not honestly sustain. The events at Ocoee, Florida, on November 2nd, 1920, on Election Day, while white Americans in the state were casting ballots in the presidential election that would bring Warren G. Harding to the White House, illustrated with particular directness what the enforcement of racial exclusion looked like at its most extreme operational register. Mose Norman, a prosperous black farmer in Ocoee's black community, attempted to vote at a polling place in Orange County and was turned away on the grounds that he had not paid the poll tax that Florida law required for voter registration, a requirement that was selectively enforced against black applicants. Norman's attempt to vote was reported to the white leadership of the community, and by that evening a white mob had gathered in the town's black residential quarter and begun burning houses. The violence continued through the night and into the following day. Estimates of the number of black residents killed range from approximately 30 to 35, though the absence of official investigation at the time means the actual figure may have been higher. The entire black community of Ocoee was displaced. Those who survived fled to surrounding counties, and the property that the black residents of the town had accumulated over the preceding decades, including Norman's own farm of approximately 40 acres, was transferred to white ownership through the legal mechanisms available in circumstances where the former owners had been killed or driven from the county and were not present to contest the transfer. Ocoee's black population, which had numbered several hundred individuals before November 2nd, was reduced to effectively zero within 48 hours. The Tulsa Race Massacre of May 31st and June 1st, 1921 represented an event of larger scale, longer duration, and more completely documented consequence than the Ocoee violence. And it destroyed one of the most materially prosperous black communities in the country in the process of demonstrating what the absence of legal protection for movement and presence in a specific geographical space ultimately made possible. The Greenwood District of Tulsa, Oklahoma, an area of approximately 35 square blocks that had developed through preceding 2 decades into a commercial and residential community of substantial economic vitality, with its own hotels, law offices, medical practices, newspapers, theaters, and churches, earning through Black America the informal designation of Black Wall Street, was burned during a 16-hour period beginning on the evening of May 31st. The immediate trigger was an accusation made against Dick Rowland, a 19-year-old black shoe shiner who had allegedly jostled or otherwise made contact with Sarah Page, a white elevator operator, in the elevator of a building in downtown Tulsa, leading to Rowland's arrest and the gathering of a white crowd outside the courthouse where he was held. The violence that followed was not spontaneous crowd action, but included the use of privately owned aircraft to survey the Greenwood District streets during the burning, the systematic looting of homes and businesses before they were set alight, and the deputization by Tulsa law enforcement of white civilians who participated in the attack under the color of official authority. Estimates of the number of people killed in the massacre range from 75 to 300, with the uncertainty reflecting the deliberate absence of official investigation and the destruction of records. Approximately 10,000 Greenwood residents were displaced from homes that no longer existed by the morning of June 1st. Among those who remained in Tulsa's legal landscape in the weeks following the massacre was Buck Colbert Franklin, an attorney practicing in the Greenwood District, whose law office had been destroyed in the burning along with the surrounding structures. Franklin continued to practice from a tent erected on the site of the former office district, representing displaced black residents in the legal proceedings that followed and challenging the Tulsa City Commission's attempt to use zoning and safety regulations to prevent the reconstruction of the Greenwood District by its former residents on the grounds that the new construction would need to comply with fire codes that the pre-existing structures had not been required to meet, a regulatory maneuver whose effect, if successful, would have converted the destruction of the community by white violence into the permanent confiscation of the underlying land through administrative process. Franklin's challenge to this regulatory maneuver contributed to its eventual failure, though the reconstruction of Greenwood proceeded slowly and was never fully completed to the pre-massacre scale. His first-hand account of the massacre, written in 1931 and not published until it was discovered by his grandson in 2015, remains among the most precise documentary records produced by a participant in the events. James Weldon Johnson, who served as executive secretary of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People from 1920 to 1930, had been working since the organization's founding to build a legal and legislative infrastructure through which the systematic exclusion and violence documented in events like Ocoee and Tulsa could be addressed at the federal level. Johnson, who was also a poet, novelist, and diplomat of substantial independent achievement, he had served as United States consul in Venezuela from 1906 to 1909 and in Nicaragua from 1909 to 1912 under President Theodore Roosevelt's appointments, brought to the organization's leadership a combination of legal and political sophistication and first-hand diplomatic experience that gave him a precise understanding of how federal institutional power operated and what the preconditions for moving it in a specific direction actually were. His most sustained legislative effort during the decade was a campaign for federal anti-lynching legislation, centered on the bill sponsored by Representative Leonidas Dyer of Missouri, which passed the House of Representatives in January of 1922 by a vote of 230 to 119, and was subsequently killed in the Senate by a Southern Democratic filibuster in December of the same year. Johnson described the filibuster's success in his 1930 autobiography Along This Way as a moment that clarified, with a precision that only institutional failure provides, the nature of what the organization was actually contending with, not ignorance or misunderstanding that could be corrected by persuasion, but organized political power whose representatives had calculated that the cost of permitting anti-lynching legislation was higher than the cost of the violence the legislation would have constrained. The traveler moving through this landscape of formal exclusion and potential violence in the 1920s had no formal guide equivalent to what Victor Hugo Green would not produce until 1936, when his first edition of the Negro Motorist Green Book provided systematic listings of hotels, restaurants, beauty parlors, and service stations that would accommodate black travelers without humiliation or refusal. The 1920s traveler navigated without that resource. The practical knowledge that substituted for it was transmitted through the networks that Black America had built over decades of operating within a hostile legal and social environment. The fraternal organizations, the Prince Hall Masons, the Elks, the Knights of Pythias, whose chapters in northern cities maintain contact with the churches and community organizations in southern ones, and could transmit information about conditions along specific routes. The Pullman porters whose national, union, the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, would not be formally organized until Philip A. Randolph established it in August of 1925, but who already functioned as an informal intelligence network carrying information between black communities at either end of the rail routes they worked, and the personal networks of church, family, and fraternal acquaintance that could identify in a town where no public accommodation was available to a black traveler, the private household that would provide a room, a meal, and sometimes a more urgent form of assistance. The practical methods that experienced black travelers developed for navigating sundown territory extended beyond knowing which towns to avoid and developed into operational strategies for moving through hostile areas with minimum exposure. Traveling in convoy with other vehicles provided some protection against the most casual forms of enforcement, on the principle that officers more readily intercepted lone travelers in groups, and that a group of vehicles was more likely to attract attention sufficient to generate witnesses. Carrying documentation of employment by a named organization, a letter from an employer on organizational letterhead establishing the traveler's identity, position, and destination, served the double purpose of answering the vagrancy challenge and of providing a named institutional party who might be contacted if the traveler did not arrive at the expected destination, planning routes to pass through known sundown territory only during daylight hours, and have identified specific stops before departure rather than relying on finding accommodation as the day's travel dictated, was standard practice among the most experienced travelers. None of these strategies eliminated the risk, and all of them were subject to the fundamental limitation that the law in a given town or county was enforced by the individuals who held authority within it, and that the existence of documentation, the availability of witnesses, or the reasonableness of the traveler's account was relevant only to the degree that the officer involved chose to make it relevant. The convergence of vagrancy law with the enforcement mechanisms of the sundown town created a legal instrument of particular efficiency against the black traveler in transit. A black individual found in a sundown town after dark, or found in any jurisdiction where his presence was unwanted regardless of the hour, could be arrested on vagrancy grounds without any specific act being required beyond presence. Could be held until a fine was paid, could be sentenced to a period of labor if the fine could not be paid, and could in this manner be processed entirely within the legal system without any of the actors in that processing having exceeded, technically, the authority the law granted them. The vagrancy statute required no proof of criminal intent, no identified victim, and no specific prohibited act. It required only a determination made by the arresting officer and subsequently ratified by the justice of the peace sitting in the same county, that the person arrested was in a condition that the statute covered. That determination was made by individuals who shared, in most cases, the social and political values of the community whose composition they were through the enforcement of the ordinance maintaining. The infrastructure of racial control over movement in 1920s America was not, in this sense, a parallel or informal system operating alongside the legal apparatus. It was a legal apparatus, applied selectively, sustained by judicial doctrine that refused to recognize its selectivity as a constitutional problem, and embedded in the administrative structures of towns, counties, and states whose formal purpose was the governance of all their residents, but whose practical operation served the interests of those who held political authority within them. The same principles of selective legal application, exclusion by administrative category, and the use of movement itself as a triggering condition for criminal exposure were simultaneously being constructed, with parallel institutional logic, into the federal immigration enforcement apparatus that Congress formalized in 1924, extending the infrastructure control from domestic travelers to the foreign-born in ways that would alter the experience of millions of people living in the American interior for the decades that followed. The intellectual framework that made the Immigration Act of 1924 possible had been assembled gradually over the preceding decade and a half in the form of a 41-volume report produced between 1907 and 1911 by the Immigration Commission appointed by Congress and chaired by Senator William Paul Dillingham of Vermont. The Dillingham Commission, as it was universally known, had been created in the aftermath of congressional anxiety about the composition of the immigration flow arriving at Ellis Island and other port of entry, anxiety rooted in the observation that the national and ethnic origins of immigrants had shifted dramatically through the preceding decades from Northern and Western European to Southern and Eastern European, producing arrivals whom the Commission characterized as racially and culturally distinct from the populations that had constituted American society through its formative period. The Commission's 41 volumes presented a comprehensive statistical portrait of immigrant life in America, organized around the premise that different national and ethnic groups could be meaningfully compared in terms of their capacity for assimilation, their economic contribution, their social pathologies, and their prospects for permanent integration into American civic life. The report's conclusions were neither uniformly hostile to immigration nor consistently rigorous in their methodology, but their organizing framework that immigrants could be classified by national origin and that different classifications warranted different policy responses, provided the intellectual architecture on which the subsequent legislative campaign for immigration restriction will be built over the following decade. That campaign drew additional reinforcement from the eugenics movement, which had achieved through the 1910s a degree of academic respectability in American universities and a corresponding political influence in state and federal legislative circles that later assessments of its scientific premises have not sustained. Madison Grant, a Manhattan attorney and amateur naturalist whose book The Passing of the Great Race had appeared in 1916, provided most widely circulated popular articulation of a racial hierarchy in which the peoples of Northern and Western Europe occupied a superior position relative to those of Southern and Eastern Europe and the Slavic countries, and argued that unrestricted immigration from those regions constituted a biological dilution whose consequences would be permanent and irreversible once the relevant demographic thresholds had been crossed. The book went through 4 American editions before 1923. Harry Hamilton Laughlin, The superintendent of the Eugenics Record Office at Cold Spring Harbor in New York testified before the House Committee on Immigration and Naturalization beginning in 1920, presenting statistical analyses that purported to demonstrate the differential representation of various immigrant nationalities in American institutions for the insane, the criminal, and the mentally deficient. A data set whose methodology subsequent reviewers dismissed as fundamentally compromised, but whose reception in the committee room of the early 1920s was largely uncritical, and whose conclusions shaped the legislative premises from which the drafting of permanent restriction legislation proceeded. The Emergency Quota Act of 1921, signed by President Warren G. Harding on May 19 that year, had established for the first time a numerical ceiling on annual immigration from each country, fixing that ceiling at 3% of the number of persons born in that country who have been resident in the United States according to the census of 1910. The effect of this formula was to advantage northern and western European countries of origin, whose populations in America were large and whose quotas were correspondingly generous, while severely constraining immigration from southern and eastern Europe, whose American populations in 1910 were smaller relative to the volume of immigration from those regions that had arrived in the subsequent decade. The 1921 Act was explicitly described by its advocates as a temporary emergency measure, pending the development of more permanent legislation designed with greater care. Representative Albert Johnson of Washington, chairman of the House Committee on Immigration and Naturalization, and Senator David Aiken Reed of Pennsylvania undertook the development of that permanent legislation, producing the Immigration Act of 1924, known formally as the Johnson-Reed Act, which President Calvin Coolidge signed into law on May 26, 1924, with remarks noting that America's welcome for immigrants had always been conditional on their capacity for assimilation, and that the new law gave that conditionality a precise and enforceable numerical form. The Johnson-Reed Act's national origins quota system reduced the annual quota for each country to 2% of the number of persons of that national origin resident in the United States, according to the census of 1900. A baseline deliberately chosen because the census of 1900 predated the peak years of Southern and Eastern European immigration, producing quota figures for those regions substantially smaller than even the 1921 Act's already restrictive numbers. The Act set an annual ceiling of approximately 165,000 on quota immigration from the Eastern Hemisphere, representing a reduction of approximately 80% from the annual volumes arriving in the years immediately before the First World War. For countries outside the quota system entirely, specifically, countries whose nationals were defined by the Act as inadmissible on racial grounds, the reduction was absolute. The legislation codified complete exclusion of immigrants from the Asian continent and the Pacific Islands, extending the earlier exclusions of the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 and the Gentleman's Agreement with Japan of 1907 and 1908 into a comprehensive statutory bar that applied to every nation from which Asian migrants had been arriving in meaningful numbers. Mexico and the other countries of the Western Hemisphere were exempt from the quota system, an exception whose practical significance for the domestic experience of immigration enforcement in the Southwest will become apparent within the decade in ways that the legislation's drafters had not systematically anticipated. The United States Border Patrol was established by the Labor Appropriation Act of 1924 with an initial authorized force of approximately 450 officers and an annual operational budget of approximately $1 million. The organization's formal mandate was the enforcement of immigration law at the land borders with Canada and Mexico, and its establishment represented the first dedicated federal law enforcement body assigned specifically to border interdiction rather than port of entry processing. What is less frequently noted in general accounts of the Border Patrol's founding is that its operational scope was not limited, from the beginning, to the geographic border itself. Agents were authorized to operate within the interior of the country along transportation corridors, specifically at rail stations, bus depots, and highway checkpoints situated at distances from the international boundary that varied with operational circumstances, on the grounds that effective interdiction of unauthorized crossers required interception before those crossers had dispersed entirely into the interior population. Interior operations at rail depots in cities, including El Paso in Texas, Tucson and Yuma in Arizona, and San Diego in California, were a feature of Border Patrol practice from its early years, And they brought the agency into contact not merely with recent unauthorized crossers, but with the settled Mexican-American communities whose members traveled the same rail lines and roads and whose documentation status was not always immediately verifiable at the moment of a field inquiry conducted at a train platform or roadside stopping point. The documentation requirements applicable to non-citizens traveling within the country's interior were sufficiently complex in their technical demands that their practical implications for ordinary movement were considerable. Non-citizens who had entered the United States legally were required under the immigration statutes to be in possession of their immigration documents at all times. And the practical consequence of being found without those documents during an interior enforcement encounter was at minimum an administrative detention for identification purposes, and at maximum a deportation, proceeding that could result in permanent removal before any judicial review of the underlying legal question was conducted. The basis for deportation without prior judicial hearing had been established in immigration law through a series of Supreme Court decisions beginning in the 1890s. On the constitutional theory that immigration enforcement was an exercise of sovereign power to determine conditions of alien presence in the national territory, a power whose exercise did not require procedural safeguards applicable to criminal prosecutions. This doctrine meant that a foreign-born resident who had been living in the United States legally for years, who had established a household, an employment record, and a community of social connection, could be removed through administrative proceedings offering significantly fewer procedural protections than a traffic court hearing. And the act of travel that brought that resident into contact with an enforcement agent operating an interior checkpoint was a triggering event through which that administrative process was initiated. The surveillance apparatus that John Edgar Hoover had built within the Bureau of Investigation's General Intelligence Division between 1919 and 1920 had not been dismantled following the Palmer raids, and Hoover carried his files and its organizational methods with him when Attorney General Harlan Fiske Stone appointed him Director of the Bureau of Investigation on May 10, 1924, at 29 years of age. The appointment came at a moment when the Bureau's reputation had been significantly compromised by its association with the Teapot Dome scandal, in which the Bureau's then-director William John Burns had been implicated in obstruction of the congressional investigation into the corrupt leasing of federal oil reserves in Wyoming and California. The new director inherited an organization requiring institutional rehabilitation and a filing system containing records on more than 200,000 individuals and organizations accumulated through 5 years of domestic surveillance. Hoover's response combined the reorganization of administrative structure and the imposition of stricter personnel standards with a simultaneous expansion and systematization of the filing and cross-referencing of intelligence on individuals and organizations whose activities he defined as relevant to the Bureau's mandate. The files maintained on immigrant community organizations, the labor federations, the anarchist newspapers, the fraternal associations of Italian, Eastern European, Jewish, Slavic, and Mexican immigrant communities were integrated into this expanded archive, and individuals who appeared in those files became subjects of institutional interest to federal law enforcement, regardless of whether their documented activities included any violation of federal criminal law. The communities most immediately affected by this convergence of formal immigration restriction, Border Patrol interior operations, and Bureau of Investigation surveillance were precisely those whose members most frequently used the country's roads and railways as working travelers rather than recreational ones. Italian immigrant communities in western Pennsylvania concentrated in the coal and steel towns of Monongahela River Valley, including McKeesport, Duquesne, and Clairton, where Italian-born workers constituted a substantial fraction of the steel industry's production workforce, were subject to Bureau of Investigation attention throughout the 1920s as a consequence of the federal government's sustained interest in Italian anarchist organizational networks following the bombing campaign of 1919. The arrest in May of 1920 of Nicola Sacco, a shoemaker in Stoughton, Massachusetts, and Bartolomeo Vanzetti, a fish peddler in Plymouth, Massachusetts, both Italian-born immigrants and self-identified anarchists, on charges of murder and armed robbery in connection with a payroll robbery in South Braintree concentrated federal and state surveillance attention on Italian immigrant communities in New England and produced a 7-year legal proceeding whose evidence and procedural fairness became a matter of international controversy, extending well beyond the specific facts of the case. Both men were executed on August 23, 1927. The case remained a subject of legal and historical examination through the remainder of the century, and its duration in the public consciousness reflected the degree to which it had crystallized for immigrant communities across the country. The relationship between political identity, national origin, and legal vulnerability in the enforcement climate of the decade. Eastern European Jewish communities in New York City and Chicago maintain a visible and institutionally complex communal life whose organizational density, encompassing mutual aid societies, Yiddish-language newspapers, labor unions, fraternal lodges, socialist political organizations, and a network of synagogues representing the full range of practice from Orthodox to Reform, made them both culturally self-sustaining and institutionally legible to federal surveillance. The Jewish Daily Forward, published from its offices on East Broadway in Lower Manhattan under the editorship of Abraham Kahn, had a circulation of approximately 200,000 at its peak in the early 1920s, making it one of the largest circulation Yiddish-language newspapers in the world and a daily record of the political views, social conditions, and institutional concerns of New York's immigrant Jewish population. The labor movement organizations with which significant portions of that population were affiliated, the International Ladies Garment Workers Union, the Amalgamated Clothing Workers of America, were subjects of Bureau of Investigation attention throughout the decade, and the movement of labor organizers between New York, Chicago, Philadelphia, and the smaller industrial cities where garment and textile manufacturing was concentrated was tracked through combinations of informant reporting and organizational correspondence interception. A labor organizer traveling by train from the east side of Manhattan to a union meeting in Chicago carried, in the Bureau's filing system, a documentary history whose contents bore on his legal status as a subject of federal interest in ways that had no equivalent for a traveler whose political associations fell outside the range of organizational types that Hoover's filing taxonomy had identified as warranting surveillance. Mexican agricultural workers in the American Southwest occupied a position in the 1920s enforcement landscape that was distinctive in several respects. Because Mexico and the other countries of the Western Hemisphere were exempt from the quota system established by the Johnson-Reed Act, legal immigration from Mexico continued without numerical ceiling throughout the decade, and the agriculture economy of California, Arizona, Texas, and the broader Southwest was substantially organized around the availability of Mexican labor for the seasonal harvest that the region's climate permitted across different areas at different points in the year. The Border Patrol's establishment in 1924 created, in this context, an enforcement apparatus whose practical operation was less frequently directed at the agricultural workers whose seasonal movement was the economic foundation of the southwestern farming system, and more frequently at the organizing activities and cross-border social networks of communities whose members moved between work on American farms and family life in Mexico in patterns that made the concept of the fixed legal status on one side or the other of the Rio Grande a poor fit for the actual conditions of their lives. A worker who had entered legally in response to an agricultural employer's recruitment worked a harvest season in California's Imperial Valley and returned to Sonora for the months when California agricultural work was unavailable was, under the technical requirements of immigration law, a person whose legal status on return depended on documentation that the conditions of seasonal labor did not always allow to be maintained with the precision the law required. The American Legion, founded in 1919 by veterans of the First World War returning from service in France and Germany, had established itself by the early 1920s as one of the most politically influential mass membership organizations in the country, with a post network covering virtually every county in the continental United States and a membership that by 1923 exceeded 3 million individuals. The Legion's official program combined advocacy for veterans' benefits with a broad Americanization agenda whose practical expressions range from the sponsorship of citizenship education programs for immigrant communities to active support for immigration restriction legislation to, in specific instances across the industrial Midwest and the mining regions of the West, the informal monitoring of immigrant organizational activity and the reporting of meetings, publications, and individuals of political concern to local law enforcement and the Bureau of Investigation field offices. The understanding that animated this informal enforcement partnership was the same understanding that had animated the Palmer raids, that the distinction between legitimate political organization and subversive activity was one that any responsible citizen could draw without formal legal expertise, and that organizations representing immigrant communities with identifiable political orientations warranted scrutiny as a matter of civic responsibility rather than specialized institutional function. The automobile's role in this enforcement landscape carried an irony that contemporary observers occasionally noted, but that the enforcement apparatus had no mechanism for addressing. The automobile had become by the mid-1920s one of the most visible symbols of Americanization, of participation in the consumer economy and the domestic ideal, that the decade's prosperity was extending to an expanding fraction of the population. Immigrant communities whose members acquired automobiles were, in this symbolic register, demonstrating assimilation, making a material investment in the American system of production and consumption, and signaling a stake in the economic order that the ownership of durable goods implied. The community newspapers serving Italian, Polish, Jewish, and other immigrant populations celebrated automotive ownership as evidence of successful integration. The automobile manufacturers' advertising, Ford's particularly, whose dealers maintained operations in immigrant neighborhoods and whose sales materials were produced in multiple languages, addressed immigrant buyers directly on the premise that the automobile was a vehicle of Americanization in both its literal and its cultural sense. The enforcement apparatus, however, applied the automobile differently, as a conveyance that, once stopped, produces occupants for inspection in a setting where the absence of proper documentation, the presence of suspect organizational materials, or the appearance of the occupants against the officer's assessment of what a properly documented person should look like was sufficient to initiate a process that could end in deportation. The same vehicle that signified belonging in the commercial imagination signified mobility in the enforcement imagination, and mobility, the capacity to move through the interior of the country, to cross the lines between jurisdictions, to carry people and their associations from one community to another, was precisely what the infrastructure control that the decade had been constructing, one statute and one administrative apparatus at a time, had been designed to monitor, and where the monitoring produced the appropriate determination to stop. The cumulative effect of the immigration enforcement architecture that crystallized in 1924 was to extend into the lives of the foreign-born resident the same logic of conditional movement that state traffic law applied to motorists, that vagrancy law applied to the economically marginal, and that the apparatus of racial exclusion applied to Black Americans. The foreign-born resident who traveled by train from Pittsburgh to Chicago, who drove across the California interior from one agricultural worksite to the next, who carried in a coat pocket documents whose technical adequacy for an immigration inquiry was a question beyond his legal training to answer with certainty, had done nothing to attract legal jeopardy beyond the act of being who he was, and moving to the country on the business that required that movement, the act of travel itself. The boarding of a train, the appearance at a roadside checkpoint, the crossing of the line between one administrative jurisdiction and the next, was the event that converted lawful presence into a question requiring administrative resolution, and the administrative resolution of that question proceeded through channels whose outcomes were not, for many of those processed through them, either predictable from the facts or proportionate to any harm that had been demonstrated. It was in this way that the American road in the 1920s became, for the traveler who was Black or poor or foreign-born or politically disfavored, something more than a physical surface between two destinations, a terrain of overlapping legal authority, whose navigation required knowledge about jurisdictional boundaries and institutional discretion that no map could supply and that no amount of careful driving could, by itself, ensure against. The systems described across the preceding decades did not dissolve suddenly or uniformly, but retreated unevenly before a combination of federal legislative action, judicial decision, and the gradual administrative harmonization that the passage of time and the expansion of automobile culture together produced. The 21st Amendment, ratified on December 5, 1933, repealed Prohibition, and with the federal criminal exposure that the ordinary automobile journey had carried for 13 years, The Uniform Vehicle Code was adopted in increasingly complete form by more states through the 1930s, reducing the jurisdictional inconsistency that had made interstate driving a persistent source of inadvertent criminal liability. The immigration quota system established by the Johnson-Reed Act of 1924 remained in force until the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965, signed by President Lyndon Baines Johnson on October 3rd of that year, at the foot of the Statue of Liberty in New York Harbor, replaced a national origins framework with a preference system emphasizing family reunification and professional qualifications. The Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956, signed by President Dwight David Eisenhower on June 29th, authorized the construction of 41,000 miles of limited-access interstate highway funded at 90% by the federal government through a dedicated highway trust fund. The physical system that Eisenhower had observed in his absence from the seat of an Army truck crossing Nebraska in the summer of 1919 was built across the following 3 decades into an infrastructure that made the kind of travel previously reserved for those with preparation, local knowledge, and sufficient legal standing genuinely routine. Victor Hugo Green's Negro Motorist Green Book, published annually from 1936 until 1966, documented across its 30 years of publication the persistent geographic fact that legislative reform did not automatically translate into safe and unimpeded travel for Black Americans. And James Lowen's research found communities in which informal racial exclusion persisted through the 1980s and beyond the passage of the Fair Housing Act of 1968. The road that the 1920s traveler had navigated at considerable legal and personal risk was eventually paved over, renumbered, and federally funded through the second half of the 20th century. But the administrative habits, doctrinal frameworks, and institutional practices that had governed it in an earlier era proved more durable than the clay surface it had originally covered. The journey across America in the 1920s had been, depending entirely on who was traveling and under what conditions, a source of administrative inconvenience, a genuine criminal hazard, or a passage through terrain whose dangers appeared on no map produced with purpose, and recognizing precisely which of those categories applied to which traveler is, in the end, an accurate description of what the decade's legal landscape actually was, and more quietly, of what landscape the decades that followed were still in the process of leaving behind. Honestly, when I first mapped this topic out, I wasn't certain there was enough material to justify a 120-minute runtime. The title sounds like it might be one of those premises that delivers 15 minutes of genuinely interesting history and then runs thin. What the research turned up was the opposite problem. There was more here than the script could fully contain, and the challenge was selection rather than expansion. The section I am most satisfied with is the one on vagrancy law and the criminalization of itinerant travel. That section benefits from having genuinely rich source material. Nels Anderson's 1923 study of hobo life is a remarkable document, specific, observant, and written from the inside by someone who had lived what he was describing. And the detail provides about the geography of migratory labor gives the section a texture that no amount of secondary synthesis can produce. The convergence of vagrancy statute, railroad police authority, and criminal syndicalism law in that section came together in a way that feels, to me, genuinely illuminating. These were not 3 separate legal systems operating independently. They were 3 components of a single control architecture, and I think the script manages to make that visible. The section on racial exclusion and sundown towns is the one that required the most care and handling. The Ocoee Massacre and the Tulsa Massacre are events that have received more attention in recent years than they did for most of the preceding century, but they are still not consistently integrated into the broader account of 1920s America that most people carry. I made a deliberate choice to present both without dramatic emphasis or editorial commentary beyond what the facts themselves supply. I believe that was correct. The material does not require amplification. The Prohibition section is probably the densest of the 6, and I will acknowledge honestly that it asks quite a lot of a listener settling in for a slow, unhurried evening. The Carroll decision is constitutionally significant enough that it warranted full treatment. It is still active law, and tracing its origin to a bootlegging stop on a road between Detroit and Grand Rapids in 1921 is precisely the kind of connection this channel exists to make. But the concentration of legal detail in that section is higher than in the others, and I notice it. The immigration section is the one I would return the most readily for revision. Every piece of material in it belongs there. But I think the connective tissue between the specific historical figures and cases could be drawn more tightly. The infrastructure control thread is present throughout, but it requires slightly more effort to follow in that section than in the ones before it. And that is a limitation I'd address if returning to the script with fresh eyes. What I am proud of is that this script takes a premise that could easily have become a list of curiosities. Strange old laws, comical local ordinances, quaint historical footnotes, and treats it instead as what it actually was, a systematic account of how American legal and administrative infrastructure determined, in precise and consequential ways, who was free to move through the country and who was not. That question is not a historical curiosity. It is still the right question to be asking. If something in here struck you differently, or if there's an angle on this topic you think deserved more attention than it received, that's exactly what the comments section is for.